The autumn wind swept across the Montana Territory with a bone-chilling ferocity that warned of the harsh winter to come. Samuel Morrison stood at the edge of his property, watching the sun dip behind the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. His weathered hands gripped the fence post he'd just hammered into the unforgiving earth, another small victory in his endless battle to tame this wild land. At 32, Samuel had already lived more life than most men twice his age. The son of a Missouri farmer, he'd headed west after the war, seeking something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps peace, perhaps purpose, or simply a place where the ghosts of Shiloh couldn't find him. He'd found this valley 5 years ago, nestled between two mountain ridges, with a creek that ran clear even in the driest months. It wasn't much, but it was his. The ranch house stood modest and sturdy, built with his own hands from logs he'd felled and stones he'd hauled from the creek bed. Inside, a single room served as kitchen, parlor, and bedroom, with a stone fireplace that fought valiantly against the mountain cold. Outside, a small barn sheltered his horses and the beginnings of a cattle herd, 15 head that he'd nursed through last winter's brutal storms. Samuel wasn't a man given to loneliness, or so he told himself. The mountains provided company enough, with their ever-changing moods and seasons. The work kept him busy from dawn to dusk, mending fences, tending stock, hunting for winter meat, cutting firewood. But lately, in the quiet hours before sleep, he'd found himself staring at the empty chair across from his own, imagining conversations with someone who wasn't there. It was old Pete McKenna down at the general store who'd first planted the seed. "A man needs a woman out here," Pete had said, polishing a jar of preserves with unusual care. "Not just for the comfort, mind you, but for the surviving. 2 pairs of hands are better than 1 when the wolves come calling or the storms blow in." Samuel had dismissed it at first, but the idea took root like a stubborn weed. He thought of the Hendersons' place, 20 miles north, where John and his wife Mary had built something resembling civilization in this wilderness. Their children ran laughing through fields they'd cleared together, and Mary's garden bloomed with vegetables and flowers that seemed impossible in this harsh soil. The decision, when it came, was practical more than romantic. Samuel had never been one for poetry or grand gestures. He needed a partner, someone strong enough for this life, willing to work alongside him without complaint. He imagined a plain, sturdy woman, perhaps a widow or a spinster past her prime, grateful for a chance at a home of her own. Someone who could cook a decent meal, mend clothes, maybe keep a kitchen garden. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated. Through Pete's connections, he'd learned of a matrimonial agency in Chicago that specialized in matching Western men with Eastern women seeking new lives. The process was simple enough. Exchange a few letters, establish compatibility, arrange for passage west. Samuel had labored over his first letter for 3 nights, his large hands clumsy with the pen. "Dear Miss," he'd written, then crossed it out. How did one begin such a thing? Finally, he'd settled on simple truth. He described his ranch, neither exaggerating its merits nor hiding its challenges. He wrote of the mountains' beauty and their danger, of the satisfaction of honest work and the hardships of isolation. He asked for a woman of good character and strong constitution, promising in return a share in all he had and all he hoped to build. The response had come from a Miss Eleanor Whitfield of Boston, writing on behalf of her younger sister Catherine. The letters that followed were proper and reserved, revealing little beyond the basic facts. Catherine was 24, educated, in good health, and willing to travel west for marriage. Her family had fallen on difficult times, and she sought an honest new beginning. No photograph was included, which suited Samuel fine. Pretty faces meant little out here where the wind could strip skin from bone and the work aged a person 10 years in 5. Now, with autumn fading into winter, the arranged date approached. Next week, Catherine Whitfield would arrive on the stage from Billings, and they would be married in the small chapel in Cedar Ridge, the nearest thing to a town in 50 miles. Samuel tried to picture her. Medium height, he imagined, with brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, hands already showing the calluses of work. Perhaps she'd have a pleasant smile, though he didn't expect beauty. Beautiful women didn't answer advertisements to marry strangers in the wilderness. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks. Samuel turned back toward the house, noting the repairs still needed on the barn roof, the firewood yet to be split. He'd hired Tom Bradley's boys to help him add a small room to the house. A woman needed some privacy. After all, it wasn't much, but it was more than many started with out here. As he reached the porch, a wolf howled in the distance, answered by another, then another. The pack was moving down from the high country, following the elk herds. They'd be trouble before winter was through, picking off calves and testing the defenses of every ranch in the valley. Samuel touched the rifle propped by the door, a familiar comfort. Whatever came, wolves, storms, or disappointed brides, he'd face it the way he always had, with steady hands and stubborn determination. Inside, he lit the oil lamp and pulled out paper and pen for one final letter to Miss Eleanor, confirming the arrangements. The stage would arrive Tuesday afternoon, weather permitting. He'd be there waiting, dressed in his one good suit, ready to meet this Catherine Whitfield and begin their practical partnership. As he wrote, the wind howled around the cabin walls like a living thing. And somewhere in the darkness, a mountain lion screamed its lonely challenge to the night. This was the world he was inviting her into, beautiful and terrible, generous and cruel by turns. He hoped she was truly as strong as her letters suggested. Out here, weakness was a luxury none could afford. The letter finished. Samuel set down his pen and stared at the dancing flames in the fireplace. In a week, that empty chair would be filled. The silence would be broken by another voice. His solitary existence would end, replaced by something he couldn't quite imagine. It should have been a comforting thought, but instead, he felt a strange unease, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to change. He thought of the stories the Indians told, of spirits that rode the wind and fate that stalked men through the high passes. Nonsense, of course. A man made his own fate out here, one decision at a time. One day at a time. He'd made his decision. Now all that remained was to see it through. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, silent and steady, covering the harsh landscape in a blanket of deceptive softness. By morning, the world would be transformed, made new and strange by winter's touch. Samuel banked the fire and prepared for bed, unaware that his own transformation was only days away, and that the ordinary bride he expected would prove to be anything but. The Tuesday morning dawned crisp and clear, with frost painting delicate patterns on every surface in Cedar Ridge. The small frontier town buzzed with unusual activity as word spread that Samuel Morrison's mail-order bride would arrive on the afternoon stage. Such events were rare enough to draw attention from every corner of the community. Samuel had arrived early, his wagon loaded with supplies from McKenna's store. He'd spent an uncomfortable night at the boarding house, tossing on the narrow bed, second-guessing every decision that had brought him to this moment. Now he stood outside the stage depot, trying to ignore the curious stares and whispered conversations around him. "That's him," he heard Mrs. Henderson murmur to her friend. "Poor soul, ordering a wife like she's a bolt of cloth from the Sears catalog." Old Pete McKenna emerged from his store, slapping Samuel on the shoulder with unnecessary force. "Big day, Morrison. Hope she's got a strong back and a stronger stomach. This country ain't for the faint-hearted." Samuel merely nodded, his jaw tight. He'd worn his Sunday suit, the dark wool already making him sweat despite the cool air. His boots were polished, his face freshly shaved, his hair slicked back with pomade that made him smell like a barber shop. He felt like a fraud, dressed up in clothes that didn't suit the man he'd become. The waiting stretched endlessly. Children played in the dusty street. Dogs barked at passing riders. And the sun climbed higher, turning the autumn air warm and golden. Samuel found himself studying every woman who passed, wondering if perhaps she'd arrived early by some other means. But no, each face was familiar, part of the small tapestry of Cedar Ridge life. Then, just past 3 o'clock, the horn sounded. The stage was coming. The crowd pressed forward as the coach rounded the bend, dust billowing behind it like a storm cloud. The driver, Jake Coulter grinned down at the assembled crowd, clearly enjoying the attention. The stage rolled to a stop with a flourish, horses stamping and blowing, their sides dark with sweat. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake called out, "I bring you goods from Billings, mail from the east, and—" He paused dramatically. "One special delivery for Mr. Samuel Morrison." The door opened. First came a traveling salesman, then an elderly couple Samuel recognized as the Millers returning from visiting family, and then Samuel's breath caught in his throat. The woman who emerged from the stagecoach moved with a grace that seemed impossible after hours of jolting travel. She was tall for a woman, with perfect posture that spoke of breeding and education, but it was her face that struck the crowd silent, porcelain skin unmarred by sun or hardship, eyes the color of spring violets, and hair like spun gold despite the dust of travel. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool, simply cut but obviously well made, and carried herself with a quiet confidence that made the rough frontier town suddenly seem even shabbier by comparison. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Catherine Whitfield, for it could be no one else, looked across the frozen tableau until her eyes found Samuel. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth as she descended the coach steps with careful dignity. Samuel stood rooted to the spot, his carefully prepared greeting dying on his lips. This wasn't right. This couldn't be right. He'd asked for plain and practical, someone who wouldn't draw attention or create complications. Instead, he faced a woman whose beauty would be remarkable even in Boston's finest drawing rooms, let alone in a Montana mining town. The crowd parted as she approached him, her steps measured and purposeful. Up close, he could see the intelligence in those violet eyes, the determination in the set of her chin. She stopped before him, neither too close nor too far, and waited. "Miss Whitfield?" His voice came out rougher than intended. "Mr. Morrison." Her voice was cultured but warm, with a hint of amusement. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting long." "No, ma'am, that is, the stage." He stopped, acutely aware of the entire town watching this exchange. He offered his arm stiffly. "Perhaps we should collect your belongings." She accepted his arm with that same small smile, and he caught a whiff of lavender beneath the dust of travel. Her hand on his arm was light but steady, and he was overwhelmingly conscious of the inadequacy of his rough wool against her fine dress. The crowd followed them to the back of the stage where Jake was unloading luggage with theatrical slowness. Catherine had brought 2 trunks and a carpet bag, more than Samuel had expected but less than he'd feared. As he hefted the first trunk, Judge Patterson approached, clearing his throat importantly. "I understand there's to be a wedding," the judge said, his eyes twinkling with barely suppressed curiosity. "The chapel is ready whenever you are." Samuel glanced at Catherine, suddenly uncertain. They'd agreed to marry immediately in their letters, but faced with the reality of this elegant stranger, he wondered if she might have changed her mind. "Miss Whitfield, if you'd prefer to rest first." "Nonsense," she said briskly. "We've made an agreement. Mr. Morrison, I see no reason to delay." She paused, then added more gently, "Unless you've had second thoughts?" The crowd leaned in collectively, waiting for his answer. Samuel straightened his shoulders. "No, ma'am, no second thoughts." The procession to the chapel was like something out of a dream. The entire town seemed to follow, whispering and exclaiming among themselves. Samuel heard snatches of conversation. "Where did she come from? Look at that dress. Morrison's got himself a prize there," and felt his discomfort grow with each step. The chapel was small and simple, built of rough-hewn logs with a single stained-glass window that cast colored light across the plank floor. Reverend Michaels waited at the altar, his weathered face creased in a welcoming smile. As they took their places, Samuel noticed how Catherine's beauty seemed to illuminate the humble space, making it appear even plainer by comparison. The ceremony was brief. They spoke the traditional vows, Samuel's voice steady despite his inner turmoil, Catherine's clear and certain. When it came time for the ring, he produced a simple gold band, the best McKenna's store had offered, and slipped it onto her slender finger. It looked inadequate there, like everything else he had to offer. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Michaels announced. Samuel bent down. She was tall, but he was taller, and brushed his lips against hers in the briefest possible contact. Her lips were soft, and he caught that lavender scent again. When he pulled back, her violet eyes were studying him with an expression he couldn't read. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Reverend announced, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Morrison." The chapel erupted in applause and congratulations. Women pressed forward to admire Catherine's dress and pepper her with questions. Men slapped Samuel on the back with a mixture of envy and disbelief. Through it all, his new wife handled the attention with gracious composure, deflecting personal questions with skillful ease while managing to seem friendly and approachable. It was nearly sunset by the time they escaped to Samuel's wagon. He'd loaded her trunks carefully, covering them with canvas against the dust. As he helped her up to the bench seat, he noticed how she gathered her skirts efficiently, how she settled herself without fuss, despite the obvious discomfort of the hard wooden seat. They rode in silence for the first mile, the town falling away behind them as they entered the wild country. The mountains loomed ahead, painted purple and gold by the setting sun. Samuel stole glances at his new wife, still struggling to reconcile the reality of her with his expectations. Finally, she spoke. "You're disappointed." The statement was so direct, so unexpected, that he nearly dropped the reins. "Ma'am? Catherine," she corrected gently. "We're married now, and you're disappointed. You expected someone different." He considered lying, then decided against it. "Your letters didn't mention, that is, I assumed, that I would be plain." She didn't sound offended, merely curious. "Would you have refused to marry me if you'd known?" Samuel thought about it honestly. "I might have wondered why a woman like you would answer an advertisement. A woman like me." She sighed, looking out at the vast landscape. "Mr. Morrison, Samuel, beauty is an accident of birth. Nothing more. It's been more burden than blessing in my life. I assure you, when my family lost everything after my father's death, my looks didn't put food on the table or keep creditors at bay. They only drew the attention of men who saw me as an ornament to be acquired." She turned to face him fully then, and he saw steel beneath the beauty. "I chose you because your letters spoke of partnership, not possession. You described the challenges honestly and asked for strength, not decoration. That's what I offer: strength, determination, and a willingness to work. Can you see past the packaging to accept what's inside?" In that moment, as the last rays of sun caught the dust motes dancing around them, Samuel heard his own thoughts from days before echoing back to him. He thought his bride would be ordinary, but her beauty transformed his world. But it wasn't just her physical beauty that struck him. It was the unexpected depth, the contradiction between appearance and substance. "I'll try," he said simply. "That's all I can promise, to try." She smiled then, a real smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "That's all anyone can promise. Now, tell me about our home. I want to know everything." As they rode on into the gathering darkness, Samuel began to speak of the ranch, the mountains, the challenges that awaited. And for the first time since she'd stepped from the stage, he began to think that perhaps, just perhaps, this impossible woman might survive the life he'd offered after all. The first morning came harsh and early. Catherine woke to the sound of Samuel moving about in the main room, trying to be quiet, but failing in the way of men unaccustomed to sharing space. Through the thin wall of her small room, she could hear him stoking the fire, the clatter of the coffee pot, the scrape of boots on wooden floors. She rose quickly, shivering in the mountain cold. Her fine nightgown offered little protection against the chill that seeped through every crack in the logs. She dressed hurriedly in the simplest dress she'd brought, a brown wool that had seemed plain in Boston, but now appeared almost comically impractical. Her fingers, already stiff with cold, fumbled with the buttons. When she emerged, Samuel looked up from the stove with surprise. "You're awake early. I thought, that is, city folks usually—" "I'm not a city folk anymore," Catherine said firmly. "What needs doing?" He gestured uncertainly toward the kitchen area. "Coffee's on. There's bacon and some biscuits from yesterday. I usually just—" "I'll manage breakfast," she interrupted, moving to inspect the supplies. The kitchen was sparse but clean, a few shelves with basic provisions, a water barrel, cast iron pans hanging from hooks. She'd watched their cook in Boston countless times, though she'd rarely been allowed to help. How hard could it be? Very hard. As it turned out, the stove was nothing like the modern range at home. It belched smoke when she opened the firebox wrong, and controlling the heat seemed to require some arcane knowledge she didn't possess. The bacon burned on one side while remaining raw on the other. Her attempt at eggs resulted in a rubbery mass that even she couldn't pretend was edible. Samuel ate without complaint, though she noticed he reached for extra biscuits and coffee. When he rose to leave, she followed him to the door. "What are your plans for the day?" He seemed surprised by the question. "Checking the fence lines in the north pasture. One of the horses threw a shoe. Need to tend that. Usual things. I'll come with you. It's rough country, and you're not dressed for—" "Then tell me how to dress for it." She met his eyes steadily. "I need to learn." "Samuel, the sooner the better." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "There's some old clothes in the trunk by the window. Belonged to Jim Bradley's boy when he helped me last season. Might fit if you cinch them tight." The clothes were a revelation. Men's trousers, a flannel shirt, a worn leather vest. Catherine had never worn such things, but she understood immediately why frontier women sometimes abandoned propriety for practicality. She tucked her hair under an old hat and presented herself for inspection. Samuel's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. "You'll do? Can you ride?" "Yes." One truth, at least. Her father had kept fine horses, and riding had been one of the few active pursuits allowed to young ladies of her station. The mountain trail tested every skill she possessed. Samuel's horses were nothing like the gentle mares of her youth. These were working animals, sure-footed but independent-minded. The saddle was different too, built for work rather than comfort. But she managed, following Samuel up increasingly steep paths, ducking low branches, navigating rocky scrambles that would have terrified her a week ago. The north pasture spread before them like a rumpled blanket, dotted with cattle and bordered by peaks that scraped the sky. Samuel dismounted to examine a section of fence, and Catherine watched him work, efficient movements, hands that knew every tool, every technique. When he began restringing wire, she climbed down to help. "Hold this," he said, handing her a length of wire. "Tight, but watch the barbs." The wire bit through her gloves almost immediately, drawing blood from her palm. She bit back a gasp and kept holding, not wanting to seem weak on her first day. But Samuel noticed. Of course, he noticed everything out here. "Let me see." His hands were gentle as he examined the cut. "Why didn't you say something?" "It's nothing. It's something if it festers. Infection kills more folks out here than bullets or bears." He produced a clean bandana from his pocket and wrapped her hand carefully. "You've got to speak up when you're hurt, Catherine. Pride's a luxury we can't afford." They worked together through the morning, Samuel teaching with patience she hadn't expected, how to spot weak points in a fence, how to approach the cattle without spooking them, how to read the sky for weather changes. She absorbed it all with the focused intensity that had once helped her master French and piano. By noon, her muscles ached in places she didn't know could ache. When Samuel suggested lunch, she sank gratefully onto a flat rock overlooking the valley. He produced hard biscuits, dried beef, and water from his saddlebags. Simple fare that tasted better than any Boston banquet after the morning's work. "You did well," he said quietly, not looking at her. "Better than I expected. I have a good teacher." She paused, then asked, "How did you learn all this?" "Trial and error, mostly. some from other ranchers when I first came out. Lost half my first cattle herd the first winter. Didn't know enough about shelter and feed storage. Nearly died myself in a late spring blizzard." He pointed to a scar on the back of his hand. "Bear taught me to be more careful around the berry patches. Every lesson out here comes with a price." They sat in comfortable silence, watching eagles circle on the thermals. Catherine felt something easing between them, the awkwardness of strangers beginning to fade, when a shadow passed over the sun. Samuel stood quickly. "Storm coming. We need to get back." The ride home was a race against the weather. Clouds boiled over the peaks like water over a dam, dark and ominous. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in minutes. By the time they reached the ranch, the first fat raindrops were falling, quickly turning to sleet. They barely got the horses into the barn before the sky opened. Hail hammered the roof like bullets, and wind screamed through the gaps in the walls. Together they fought to secure loose boards, stuff rags in the worst cracks, protect what they could from the storm's fury. Inside the house, soaked and shivering, they stood dripping on the plank floor. Samuel built up the fire while Catherine changed into dry clothes, another simple dress that now seemed wonderfully practical compared to her travel finery. When she returned, he'd made coffee, strong and black. "These storms?" she asked. "How often?" "Often enough. This is mild for autumn. Winter." He shook his head. "Winter's a different beast entirely." That evening, she tried again with dinner. The results were marginally better. The venison was tough but cooked through, the potatoes only slightly scorched. They ate by firelight, the storm still raging outside. And Catherine found herself telling him about Boston, about the life she'd left behind. "My father was a merchant," she said. "Ships and shipping, mostly to Europe. We had a beautiful house on Beacon Hill. Servants, carriages. I was meant to marry well, manage a household, host parties." She laughed bitterly. "Then Father's partner embezzled everything. Father's heart gave out from the strain, and suddenly we were penniless. My mother took in sewing. My younger sisters went to work in factories, and I—" "You answered an advertisement," Samuel finished quietly. "My looks were supposed to save us. Mother paraded me before every eligible bachelor in Boston, but word of our disgrace had spread. The only offers I received were inappropriate. So yes, I answered your advertisement. At least you offered honest work and respect along with hardship." Samuel stared into the fire. "I'm sorry. About your family, I mean, don't be—" "We all make choices." She looked around the simple room, at the man who was now her husband. "I'm beginning to think I made the right one." Later, as they prepared for sleep in their separate rooms, Samuel paused at her door. "Tomorrow we'll start on the winter preparations. It'll be hard work. I'm not afraid of hard work. No," he said, with something like wonder in his voice. "I'm beginning to see that you're not—" That night, Catherine lay in her narrow bed listening to the storm gradually exhaust itself. Her hands throbbed where the wire had cut them. Her muscles ached from the unaccustomed labor, and her fine clothes hung useless in the corner. But for the first time since leaving Boston, she felt something like hope. She thought of Samuel's patience as he taught her, the careful way he'd bandaged her hand, the surprise in his eyes when she'd kept up on the difficult trail. They were strangers still, bound by necessity and a few spoken vows. But perhaps, in this harsh and beautiful place, they might build something more. Outside, the wind gentled to a whisper, and somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled, lonely but defiant, claiming its place in the world. Catherine pulled the rough blanket higher and closed her eyes, ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring. The news came with Tom Bradley on a frost-covered morning 2 weeks later. Catherine was kneading bread dough, a skill she'd finally begun to master, when the young man burst through the door without knocking, his face white with fear. "Mr. Morrison. They hit the Weatherby place last night. Took everything, horses, cattle, even the winter stores. Left old man Weatherby beaten half to death." Samuel set down his coffee cup slowly, his expression hardening. "The Coulter gang?" Who else? 5 of them, maybe 6, misses. Weatherby said the leader had that scar across his face, just like always. Catherine's hands stilled in the dough. She'd heard whispers of the Coulter gang in town, remnants of Confederate raiders who'd turned to banditry after the war. Jake Coulter himself was said to be utterly ruthless, taking particular pleasure in terrorizing isolated ranches. "They're working their way south," Samuel said, moving to the window to scan the horizon. "Henderson's place, then Weatherby's. We're next in line." "The sheriff," Tom began, "is 2 days' ride away, assuming we could even find him." Samuel's jaw tightened. "No, we're on our own out here, always have been." After Tom left to warn the other scattered homesteads, Samuel began preparations with grim efficiency. He brought the horses closer to the house, moved the cattle into the most defensible pasture, and started checking weapons. Catherine watched him clean and load the rifles, noting how his hands moved with practiced ease. "Teach me," she said quietly. He looked up, surprised. "This isn't women's work, Catherine. Neither is anything else I've been doing." She held out her hand for the rifle. "If they come, I won't hide in the root cellar like a frightened rabbit." Something shifted in his expression, respect, perhaps, or recognition. He handed her the lighter of the 2 rifles, a Winchester repeater. "Have you ever fired a gun?" "My father taught me to shoot targets with a pistol. For sport. This is different. When you're shooting at a man who's shooting back." He paused, then continued more gently. "The kick is stronger than a pistol. Brace it tight against your shoulder." They spent the afternoon in practice, Samuel teaching her to load quickly, to lead a moving target, to find cover while reloading. Her shoulder ached from the recoil, but her aim improved with each round. By evening, she could hit a tin can at 50 yards, more often than not. That night, they didn't retire to separate rooms. Instead, they sat by the fire, weapons within reach, taking turns keeping watch. It was during Catherine's watch that they talked, really talked, for the first time. "Were you in the war?" she asked, noting how he held the rifle like an extension of himself. 3 years, Illinois 33rd Infantry." His voice was flat, offering facts without emotion. "Shiloh, Vicksburg, the March to the Sea. Is that why you came west? To escape the memories?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Partly, but mostly because I was tired of fighting other men's wars for other men's reasons. Out here, when you fight, it's for something real. Your land, your life, your—" He glanced at her, then away. "Your family. Is that what we are? Family? We're married. That's not what I asked." He looked at her directly then, firelight dancing in his dark eyes. "I don't know what we are yet, but when those raiders come, I'll fight for you the same as I'd fight for the land or the cattle. Because you're here, because you've chosen to stay and work alongside me. That makes you worth protecting." The first attack came 3 nights later. Catherine woke to the sound of horses and rough voices. Samuel was already moving, pressing a rifle into her hands. "The loft," he whispered. "You can cover the door from there." She wanted to protest, to stay beside him, but she recognized the tactical wisdom. She climbed the ladder quickly, positioning herself where she could see through the gaps in the floorboards. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady on the rifle. "Morrison," a voice called from outside, rough, mocking. "We know you're in there. Come on out and we might leave your pretty wife in one piece." Samuel's voice was calm as granite. "Get off my land, Coulter. Now that's not very neighborly. We're just looking to resupply. Winter's coming, and we need provisions. You can spare some cattle. Maybe those horses we saw in the barn." I said, "Get off my land." The response was a fusillade of gunfire that shattered the front windows. Catherine saw Samuel drop behind the overturned table he'd positioned as cover, returning fire through the broken glass. The battle had begun. What followed was the longest hour of Catherine's life. The raiders tried to rush the house twice, driven back each time by Samuel's deadly accuracy and Catherine's supporting fire from above. She learned that shooting at men was indeed different from targets. Her first shots went wild, her hands shaking with the reality of violence. But when a raider tried to climb through the side window, nearly reaching Samuel's blind spot, training took over. Her shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him back into the darkness. The barn caught fire around midnight, whether by accident or design. The orange glow illuminated figures running between cover, made shadows dance like demons. One of the horses screamed, and Catherine bit back a sob. But she kept shooting, kept reloading, kept watching Samuel's back. A lull came as the raiders regrouped. Catherine could hear them arguing. Some wanted to continue the assault, others to cut their losses. She counted muzzle flashes. 4, maybe 5 still active. At least one was down in the yard, unmoving. "Morrison, Coulter again. This is your last chance. Walk out now and we'll make it quick." Samuel laughed, actually laughed. "You're down at least 2 men. Coulter, maybe 3. Your ammunition's running low, and dawn's coming. I've got food, water, and more bullets than you've got men. You sure you want to continue this dance? You got lucky, soldier boy, but luck runs out. So does patience. Next man I see on my property gets a bullet. No warning." There was a long silence. Then the sound of horses, moving away fast. Catherine waited, hardly daring to breathe, until Samuel called up to her. "They're gone, for now." She climbed down on shaking legs, the rifle suddenly weighing 100 pounds. Samuel caught her as she stumbled, his arm strung around her waist. For a moment they stood frozen, pressed together in the acrid smoke and gunpowder smell. Then he set her back, his expression unreadable. They spent the rest of the night putting out fires, tending the spooked animals, and fortifying their defenses. The barn was half destroyed but salvageable. They'd lost 2 horses to smoke and panic, but the rest survived. As dawn broke, they found 3 dead raiders in the yard, evidence that their defense had been more effective than she'd realized. Sheriff Watson arrived 2 days later with a posse, far too late to help but eager to claim credit for driving off the gang. He looked at the bullet holes, the blood stains, the burned barn, and shook his head. "You're lucky to be alive. Luck had nothing to do with it." Samuel said curtly, "My wife's a fine shot." The sheriff's eyebrows rose as he took in Catherine's appearance, still dressed in men's clothes, a pistol on her hip, bandages on her hands from fighting the fires. "That's so? Well, Mrs. Morrison, you're tougher than you look." After the posse left, carrying the bodies and promises to hunt down Coulter, Samuel found Catherine sitting on the porch steps, staring at the mountains. He sat beside her, close but not touching. "You all right?" She considered the question honestly. "I shot a man, maybe killed him, to save my life, to save both our lives. I know, and I'd do it again." She looked at her hands, surprised to see they weren't shaking anymore. "That's what troubles me. I came from a world of tea parties and poetry readings, and now I can shoot a man and sleep soundly after." "You're adapting. That's survival out here." "Is that what we're doing? Just surviving?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, as if the words were fragile, "When I saw you up in that loft, covering my back, shooting steady as any soldier I served with, I thought maybe we're doing more than surviving. Maybe we're building something." She looked at him then, this man who'd become her husband by necessity and her partner by choice. His face was smudged with soot, his shirt torn, a new cut along his jaw from flying glass, but his eyes were warm as he looked back at her, warm with something that might have been admiration, or pride, or the beginning of something deeper. "Yes," she said simply, "I think we are." That night, for the first time, Samuel kissed her properly, not the brief brush of lips at their wedding, but something real and honest and earned. And when he finally spoke the words that had echoed in his mind since the day she arrived, they came from a place of truth. "I thought my bride would be ordinary, but your beauty, your courage, transformed my world." The trouble started at Sunday service. 3 weeks after the raid, Catherine had grown accustomed to the stares and whispers that followed her through Cedar Ridge. Her beauty ensured that. But this was different. The usual curious glances had turned cold, calculating. Mrs. Abigail Patterson, the judge's wife and self-appointed moral guardian of the town, was holding court near the church steps. Her voice carried clearly across the yard. "It's simply not natural, a woman fighting like that, and those clothes she wears. My husband saw her in town last week, dressed like a man, bold as brass." Catherine kept her chin high as she and Samuel approached the church, but she felt the weight of judgment in every glance. Inside, the congregation shifted away from their usual pew as if misfortune might be contagious. After the service, Reverend Michael stopped them at the door. His weathered face was kind but troubled. "Mrs. Morrison, might I have a word?" Samuel tensed beside her, but Catherine touched his arm gently. "Of course, Reverend. I've heard concerning rumors about your past in Boston, about why you really came west." He lowered his voice. "Some say you're running from scandal, that you're not the widow you claim to be." "I never claimed to be a widow," Catherine said evenly. "And my past is exactly what I told my husband. Family misfortune and honest poverty. If that's scandalous, then I'm guilty." But the damage was done. The rumors spread like wildfire through the small community, growing more elaborate with each telling. By the time they reached Samuel at the feed store, Catherine had transformed from a ruined merchant's daughter into everything from a dance hall girl to a Confederate spy. "Pay it no mind," Samuel said that evening as they shared a quiet supper. But Catherine saw the tightness in his jaw, the way his knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. "It bothers you," she observed. "What they're saying. What bothers me is their small-mindedness. You fought beside me, saved my life, and they're worried about what you wear." He shook his head. "I've seen men lauded as heroes for less courage than you showed." The social isolation deepened over the following weeks. At the general store, Mrs. McKenna served Catherine with pinched lips and averted eyes, though she'd been friendly enough before. The other ranchers' wives drew their skirts aside when Catherine passed, as if scandal might be contagious. Even the men, who'd initially admired her spirit, now regarded her with suspicion. The breaking point came at the harvest dance. Catherine had spent days on a new dress, trying to strike a balance between frontier practicality and feminine respectability. She'd practiced recipes until she could contribute a respectable apple pie to the communal supper. She was determined to bridge the growing gulf between herself and the community. They entered the decorated barn to a wave of silence. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Dancers faltered in their steps. Then, deliberately, the crowd reformed, leaving the Morrisons in an island of empty space. Samuel's face darkened. "We're leaving." "No." Catherine's voice was quiet but firm. "That's what they want." She walked to the refreshment table with measured steps, her head high. Behind her, she heard Abigail Patterson's stage whisper, "The brass of that woman, showing her face here. And after what I heard about Boston." "What exactly did you hear about Boston, Mrs. Patterson?" Catherine's clear voice cut through the barn like a blade. She turned to face her chief tormentor, and something in her expression made the older woman step back. "Why, that is, everyone knows." "What everyone knows is gossip and speculation." Catherine's voice remained calm, but her violet eyes blazed. "Shall I tell you the truth about Boston, Mrs. Patterson? Shall I tell you about watching my father die of shame after his trusted partner stole everything? About my mother's fingers bleeding from taking in sewing to feed my younger sisters? About the respectable men who offered to make me their mistress because a beautiful woman without money must surely be for sale?" The barn was utterly silent now, all pretense of disinterest abandoned. "I came west because Samuel Morrison was the only man who offered honest work and respect along with marriage. I wear men's clothes because skirts don't suit ranch work. I learned to shoot because raiders don't respect feminine delicacy. And if that makes me scandalous, then so be it." She turned to Samuel, who stood frozen by the door. "I apologize for embarrassing you. Perhaps we should leave after all." But Samuel crossed the floor in 3 strides, taking her arm with deliberate possession. The only embarrassment here is the small-mindedness of people who should know better. His voice carried to every corner of the barn. My wife has worked harder and shown more courage in 2 months than most people manage in a lifetime. Anyone who has a problem with her has a problem with me. Young Tom Bradley started the applause, followed by his father, then the Hendersons. Not everyone joined in, but enough did to break the spell of hostility. The fiddler struck up a tune, and gradually, tentatively, the dance resumed. But the damage lingered. Over the following weeks, Catherine found herself increasingly isolated. The general store was often out of items she needed. Her attempts at friendship were rebuffed with cold politeness, even at church. She sat in a bubble of empty pews. One gray November afternoon, she found Samuel watching her from the doorway as she mended harness leather, a skill she'd mastered out of necessity. "You regret it," he said. It wasn't a question. She considered her answer carefully. "I regret that narrow minds and jealous hearts have such power. But no, I don't regret coming here. Not anymore. Even with all this, Samuel, I've faced down armed raiders and survived misses. Patterson's disapproval seems rather trivial by comparison." He moved into the room, something uncertain in his expression. "You could go back to Boston. I wouldn't. That is, if this life is too hard. Is that what you want? For me to leave?" "No!" The word exploded from him. Then, quieter. "No, but I never meant for you to be so alone. A woman needs friends, social connections." Catherine set down the harness and stood to face him. "I have you. That's enough." "Is it?" He searched her face. "Is it really enough?" She thought of the empty afternoons when ranch work was done, the silence where women's laughter should be, the isolation that pressed in like the mountains themselves. Then she thought of the way Samuel had defended her at the dance, the growing warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, the partnership they'd built through trial and hardship. "Yes," she said simply. "It's enough." That night, Samuel surprised her with a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a set of pen nibs. "I thought you might want to write to your sisters, or just thoughts. You mentioned you used to write poetry in Boston." The gesture was so unexpected, so thoughtful, that tears pricked her eyes. "Samuel, you've given up so much, your whole world. Really, I just wanted—" He struggled for words. "I wanted you to have something that was yours." She kissed him then, pouring into it all the gratitude and growing affection she couldn't yet voice. When they broke apart, his eyes were dark with emotion. "They're wrong about you," he said roughly. "All of them. You're the finest woman I've ever known." Later, as Catherine sat by the fire filling the first pages of her journal, she reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. She'd lost the approval of society, first in Boston, now in Cedar Ridge. But in its place, she'd found something more valuable, a partner who saw her true worth, who valued her strength over her beauty, her courage over conventional propriety. The wind howled outside, winter tightening its grip on the mountains. Soon they'd be truly isolated, cut off by snow and ice from even the dubious comfort of town society. But as she watched Samuel cleaning his rifle by lamplight, his face serious and dear in the golden glow, Catherine found she didn't mind the prospect. Let them whisper and judge and ostracize. She'd found her place in this harsh, beautiful world, and it was right here, beside a man who'd thought he was getting an ordinary bride, but had embraced the extraordinary woman she'd proven to be. The blizzard struck on December 15th with a fury that made their autumn storms seem like gentle showers. Catherine woke to a world transformed. Snow pressed against the windows so thick it blocked out all light, while wind screamed around the cabin like a living thing bent on destruction. Samuel was already up, stoking the fire with grim determination. "We need to get to the animals," he said without preamble. "This storm could last days." They dressed in layers, everything they owned, practically, and tied themselves together with rope before venturing outside. The cold hit Catherine like a physical blow, stealing her breath and instantly numbing any exposed skin. She couldn't see Samuel just 3 feet ahead. Only the rope between them kept her oriented in the white chaos. The barn was perhaps 50 yards from the house, but it might as well have been miles. They fought for every step, leaning into wind that threatened to throw them down. When they finally reached the barn door, it took both of them to force it open against the snow already piled against it. Inside, the animals huddled together for warmth, their breath creating clouds in the frigid air. The water barrels were frozen solid, while Samuel broke ice with an axe. Catherine distributed the carefully rationed hay. They'd prepared for winter. But this storm was testing every preparation. "The Henderson place is lower, more exposed," Samuel said, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face. "They might need help." "You can't go out in this," Catherine protested. "You'd never make it 500 yards, let alone 5 miles. He knew she was right, but she saw the torment in his eyes. Out here, neighbors depended on each other. Not being able to help went against every code of frontier survival. They made it back to the house through providence more than skill, following the rope they'd strung between buildings. Inside, they collapsed against the door, shaking with cold and exhaustion. Ice crystals fell from their clothes like strange snow. Days blurred together in a rhythm of survival. Twice daily, they fought their way to the barn. Between trips, they huddled by the fire, burning through their woodpile at an alarming rate. The storm raged on, seemingly endless, while their supplies dwindled. On the 4th day, the roof began to groan under the weight of snow. Samuel climbed into the rafters with a pole, trying to push snow off from inside, but it was futile. That night, they took turns staying awake, listening to the ominous creaking above their heads. The collapse came just before dawn. A thunderous crack. Then the world caved in. Snow and timber crashed down into the eastern corner of the cabin, where Catherine's small room had been. If she'd been sleeping there instead of by the fire with Samuel. "We need to shore it up," Samuel said, already moving. "If the rest goes," they worked frantically, using furniture and spare lumber to brace the remaining roof. Snow continued to pour through the gap, and the wind now had direct access to their shelter. The temperature inside plummeted. "We'll have to live by the fire," Samuel decided. They dragged their mattresses close to the hearth, hung blankets to create a smaller space that might hold heat. It was primitive, desperate, but it was survival. The food situation grew critical by week's end. They were down to dried beans, a few pounds of flour, and whatever preserved meat remained. The root cellar was buried under tons of snow. Samuel tried to dig down to it, but had to abandon the attempt when the tunnel he'd carved began to collapse. "We'll make it," he said firmly when he saw Catherine counting their remaining supplies. "Storm can't last forever." But privately, she saw his worry. They had maybe 2 weeks of food if they stretched it. Less if they wanted to maintain the energy needed for the constant battle against cold. The firewood was disappearing faster than anticipated with the roof breach letting in Arctic air. On the 10th day, the wind finally died. They emerged like cave dwellers into a world made alien by snow. Drifts reached the cabin's remaining roof. The landscape's familiar markers had vanished under a white blanket that stretched endlessly in all directions. "The animals?" Catherine breathed, and they plowed through chest-deep snow toward the barn, or where the barn should have been. They found it by the muffled sounds of cattle in distress. The structure had partially collapsed, trapping several animals. What followed was a desperate excavation. They dug with shovels, boards, even their hands when tools proved too slow. 3 cattle were already dead, frozen where they'd been trapped, but they saved the rest, including their precious horses. The surviving animals were gaunt, wild-eyed with hunger and thirst. "There's hay in the loft," Samuel said, "if we can reach it." The damaged structure groaned threateningly as they worked to access the feed stores. Every beam could give way. Every step could trigger a total collapse. But they had no choice. Without the animals, they'd never survive the winter. Catherine held her breath as Samuel climbed into the unstable loft. Each board that creaked made her heart stop. When a section gave way and he barely caught himself, she bit back a scream, but he managed to throw down enough hay to keep the animals fed for days. That night, exhausted beyond measure, they sat close together by their makeshift hearth. The cabin was a wreck, their food nearly gone, half their livestock dead. But they were alive. "I'm sorry," Samuel said quietly. "I promised you a life, not just survival." Catherine took his hand, feeling the calluses and new frostbite scars. "You promised me a partnership. That's what this is. Partners in misery. Partners in everything," she corrected. "The good and the bad. Though I admit, this is testing the worst part of, for better or worse." He managed a slight smile. "Your Boston friends would be horrified to see you now." She looked down at herself. Multiple layers of rough clothing, hands raw from digging, hair that hadn't seen a proper washing in weeks. The elegant Catherine Whitfield of Beacon Hill was a lifetime away. "They'd be horrified, but I think I'd be proud." She met his eyes. "We're surviving something that would kill most people. We're doing it together. That matters." The next morning brought a miracle. Clear skies and sunshine that made the snow-covered world sparkle like diamonds. But it also brought new challenges. They needed food, needed to repair shelter for the animals, needed firewood, and they needed to check on their neighbors, if possible. Samuel fashioned crude snowshoes from barn siding and rawhide. "I'll try to reach town," he decided. "Get supplies. Check on the others." "We'll try," Catherine corrected. "You're not leaving me here alone." He started to protest, then stopped. She'd earned the right to make such decisions. They'd face whatever came next the way they'd faced everything else. Together. The journey that normally took 3 hours took all day. They floundered through drifts, navigated by sun and instinct when familiar landmarks were buried. Exhaustion dogged every step, but they pressed on with the determination that had kept them alive this far. When the buildings of Cedar Ridge finally appeared, they looked like a mirage. Smoke rose from chimneys. The town had survived. As they staggered down Main Street, people emerged to stare. They looked like winter spirits, so covered in ice and frost as to be barely human. "My God," Pete McKenna breathed. "We thought for sure you folks were dead." The next hours passed in a blur. Hot food, warm shelter, and the news of who'd survived and who hadn't. The Hendersons had made it, though they'd lost their barn. 2 families further out hadn't been so lucky. The storm had claimed 8 lives in the valley, along with countless livestock. But there was something else in the townspeople's eyes as they looked at Catherine. A newfound respect. She'd survived what killed others, had walked 15 miles through impossible conditions. The woman they'd gossiped about and shunned had proven herself in the only way that truly mattered out here. Even Abigail Patterson, serving soup at the church, met Catherine's eyes with something approaching acknowledgement. "You'll need supplies," she said quietly. "We all will. Spring's a long way off." It was as close to an apology as Catherine would get, and she accepted it gracefully. Out here, survival trumped social prejudice. The winter had months yet to run, and they'd need each other before it was through. That night, sheltering in the church with other storm refugees, Catherine leaned against Samuel's shoulder. They'd lost so much: shelter, livestock, carefully hoarded supplies. But they'd gained something too, the knowledge that together they could survive anything this harsh land threw at them. "Still think your bride transformed your world?" she asked quietly, remembering his words from weeks ago. He pressed a kiss to her frost-damaged hair. "More than ever, just maybe not the way I expected." Outside, the temperature dropped towards 0 again. Winter was far from finished with them, but as Catherine drifted toward exhausted sleep, surrounded by the quiet breathing of neighbors who'd accepted them at last, she felt oddly at peace. They'd been tested by ice and wind and near starvation. They'd emerged scarred but stronger. Whatever came next, they'd meet it as they'd met everything else, hand in hand, backs straight, facing the storm together. Spring came late to the mountains, arriving in fits and starts through March and into April. The snow retreated grudgingly, revealing the scars of winter, dead cattle, damaged buildings, and a landscape altered by the fierce storms. Samuel and Catherine had rebuilt through the remaining winter months, their cabin patched but standing, their surviving livestock thin but alive. It was on a morning when the first wildflowers pushed through the remaining snow that Tom Bradley came riding hard into their yard, his horse lathered with sweat. "They're back!" he shouted before his feet hit the ground. "Coulter's gang! They hit the Murphy place at dawn. Killed Sean Murphy when he tried to fight. They're heading this way, picking off the ranches one by one." Samuel's face went stone hard. "How many? 8, maybe 10. They've got new men, harder ones. Word is Coulter swore revenge for his boys you killed in the fall." Catherine felt ice in her veins that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The sheriff. 3 days out, chasing rustlers near Bozeman. Tom's young face was grim. "But Mr. Morrison, this time folks are ready to fight. Pa's gathering men at our place. Will you come?" Samuel was already reaching for his rifle. "Catherine, I want you to prepare defenses here," she interrupted. "If they break through your line, someone needs to be ready." He studied her face, seeing the steel that had carried her through winter's worst. "Tom, tell your father we'll be there within the hour. Both of us." The Bradley Ranch was a scene of controlled chaos when they arrived. Men from across the valley had gathered. Some Catherine recognized. Others were strangers, all united by the threat to their homes. John Bradley stood at the center, organizing defenses with the efficiency of a former cavalry officer. "Morrison, good. We'll need your military experience." Bradley's eyes swept over Catherine in her men's clothing, rifle in hand, but he merely nodded. Winter had taught them all that survival didn't follow society's rules. "Where are they now?" Samuel asked. "Holed up at the old Jameson mine, about 5 miles north. They'll likely hit the Watson place next, then sweep south." Bradley pointed to a crude map. "I figure we meet them at Miller's Creek. Good cover, high ground on our side." "No." Samuel's voice cut through the planning. "That's what they expect. Coulter's too smart to ride into an ambush." He studied the map. "They'll circle east. Come at us through Bright Canyon. It's harder riding, but better for surprise." The men murmured skeptically, but Bradley nodded slowly. "You know Coulter's type from the war. I know men like him don't survive by being predictable." Samuel traced a different route. "We split our forces, main group at Miller's Creek as decoy. 6 of us with the best shots wait in the canyon. That's suicide if you're wrong." Someone protested. "It's suicide if we're spread too thin when they hit." Samuel countered. "Trust me." In the end, they did. As the larger force rode toward Miller's Creek, Samuel led his picked group toward Bright Canyon, himself, Catherine, Tom Bradley, his father John, and 2 Henderson brothers known for their marksmanship. The canyon was a narrow defile carved by centuries of spring floods, its walls offering both cover and trap in equal measure. They waited through the afternoon, tension growing with each passing hour. Catherine positioned herself behind a fallen boulder, checking and rechecking her rifle. Below, the canyon floor remained empty save for a creek running high with snowmelt. Then, just as shadows began to lengthen, she heard it, horses approaching from the east, trying to move quietly but betrayed by loose stones. Samuel had been right. The gang entered the canyon in single file, necessity in the narrow space. Coulter rode third, his scarred face visible even at distance. They moved cautiously but confidently, believing their surprise intact. Samuel let them get deep into the canyon before firing the first shot. It took the lead rider's hat off, the crack echoing between stone walls like thunder. "Jake Coulter, this is your last chance to surrender." The response was instant chaos. Outlaws dove from horses, seeking cover that barely existed in the narrow space. Gunfire erupted from both sides as the ambushers opened up. The canyon became a cauldron of sound and fury. Catherine forced herself to breathe steady, to pick targets carefully. These weren't panicked raiders in darkness, but desperate men fighting for their lives. A bullet whined off her boulder, showering her with stone fragments. Another tore through her sleeve, missing flesh by inches. She saw Tom Bradley go down, clutching his leg, and her heart clenched. But the young man dragged himself behind cover and kept shooting. Beside him, his father fought with cold precision, making every shot count. The outlaws tried to retreat but found their escape route blocked. The main force from Miller's Creek had heard the gunfire and circled back, trapped between two fires. Some gang members threw down their weapons, others fought harder, knowing the noose waited if they surrendered. Coulter himself seemed untouchable, moving between cover with uncanny skill, his guns never silent. Catherine watched him reload with impossible speed, saw him put a bullet through John Henderson's shoulder, witnessed the cold calculation in his movements. Then she saw him drawing a bead on Samuel, who was exposed while pulling Tom to better cover. Time slowed. Catherine's world narrowed to the sight picture, Coulter's chest centered in her rifle's notch. She squeezed the trigger with all the care Samuel had taught her. The rifle bucked, the shot echoed, and Jake Coulter spun and fell. But he wasn't done. Even wounded, the outlaw leader rolled behind a rock, still fighting. It was Samuel who ended it, advancing with terrible purpose, trading shots until he stood over Coulter's position. One final exchange of gunfire. Then silence. "It's over," Samuel called out. "Throw down your weapons." One by one, the surviving outlaws complied. Of the 10 who'd entered the canyon, 4 were dead, 3 wounded, 3 surrendering. On their side, Tom had a bullet in his thigh. John Henderson's shoulder was torn up, and everyone sported cuts and bruises from rock fragments. But they were alive. As men secured prisoners and tended wounded, Catherine found Samuel standing over Coulter's body. The outlaw leader had taken 3 bullets, but had kept fighting to the end. He was brave, Samuel said quietly. Wrong, but brave. "So were you." Catherine touched his arm. "That advance, you could have been killed." "He had you in his sights. I saw him tracking you." Samuel's voice was rough. "I couldn't let—" He didn't finish, but Catherine understood. In that moment of battle, he'd risked everything to protect her, just as she'd shot to save him. They'd come full circle from that first raid, no longer strangers bound by necessity, but partners bound by choice. Sheriff Watson arrived the next day to find justice already largely done. The surviving gang members would hang or face long prison terms. The threat that had shadowed the valley for years was finally ended. But it was the aftermath that surprised Catherine most. As they prepared to leave the Bradley ranch, woman after woman approached her. Ranch wives who'd held themselves aloof all winter. Mary Henderson pressed her hand. "Thank you for fighting for our men." Even Abigail Patterson, that bastion of propriety, offered grudging words. "You've a steady hand and a brave heart. Mrs. Morrison, I was wrong about you." The ride home was quiet, both of them processing the violence and its resolution. As their cabin came into view, patched and weathered but still standing, Samuel finally spoke. "You've earned their respect. They'll accept you now." "Does it matter?" Catherine asked honestly. "Their acceptance." He considered. "It makes life easier. But no, it doesn't matter. Not compared to—" He gestured between them, struggling for words. "Compared to us," she finished. "To what we've built." That evening, as they tended each other's minor wounds, Catherine reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. She'd answered an advertisement seeking a plain, practical wife for a lonely rancher. Instead, they'd forged something entirely different, a partnership tested by violence, strengthened by hardship, and tempered by mutual respect that had grown into something deeper. "Do you still think about it?" Samuel asked suddenly. "The life you might have had." Catherine looked around their simple home, rough walls patched with their own hands, furniture cobbled together from necessity, everything marked by the struggle to survive. Then she looked at Samuel, this man who'd taught her strength, who'd stood beside her against all threats, who'd risked his life because someone had her in their sights. "No," she said simply. "This is my life, the only one I want." He kissed her then, with all the passion held in check through months of careful partnership. When they broke apart, his eyes held warmth that had nothing to do with the fire's glow. "My beautiful, brave wife," he murmured. "My partner in all things." Outside, spring evening settled over the mountains with a peace that had been absent too long. The Coulter threat was ended. Winter's hardships were past. The community that had rejected Catherine now accepted her as one of their own, not for her beauty, but for her courage. They'd survived the worst the frontier could offer. Now, perhaps, they could begin to truly live. Dawn broke golden over the Morrison ranch, painting the mountains in shades of rose and amber. Catherine stood on the porch of their rebuilt home, stronger now than before winter's assault, watching the sun transform the landscape that had become her world. The morning air carried the scent of wild roses and new grass, promises of the summer ahead. A year. It had been exactly 1 year since she'd stepped off that stage in Cedar Ridge, a stranger in silk, expecting to find a simple life with an ordinary man. How naive she'd been. How unprepared for the reality of this beautiful, brutal land. "Coffee's ready," Samuel called from inside, his voice warm with the casual intimacy they'd developed through shared trials. She joined him at their table, a proper one now, crafted by his hands during the long winter evenings after the storms. The kitchen boasted new additions too, shelves filled with preserves she'd learned to make, herbs drying from the rafters, curtains at windows that now had proper glass. "The Hendersons are bringing their new bull by today," Samuel said, passing her a cup. "Thought we might trade 2 calves for breeding rights." Catherine nodded, her mind already calculating the benefits to their slowly growing herd. She'd become as invested in the ranch's success as Samuel, understanding every animal, every acre, every decision that would build their future. "And Mary Henderson mentioned she'd like to learn to shoot properly," Catherine added. "Several of the women do. After everything." Samuel's smile held pride. "Started a revolution. You have proper Boston lady teaching frontier women to be improper." "Survival isn't improper," Catherine countered. But she smiled too. The women who'd once shunned her now sought her counsel. Having seen what prepared determination could accomplish, they worked through the morning in companionable partnership, Catherine tending her expanded garden while Samuel repaired fencing. The rhythm of ranch life had become second nature to her, each task flowing into the next with practiced ease. When the Hendersons arrived, she greeted Mary as a friend, their past tensions forgotten in the bonds forged by shared hardship. It was afternoon when Samuel found her by the creek, washing clothes in the clear mountain water. He watched her for a moment, this woman who'd traded silk for homespun, tea parties for cattle drives, safety for freedom, and felt that familiar tightness in his chest that had grown stronger through their trials. "Catherine." She looked up, shading her eyes against the sun. "Yes? I've been thinking about us, about everything we've built here." He moved closer, suddenly uncertain despite all they'd shared. "When you arrived, I thought I was getting a business partner, someone to share the work, nothing more. And now," her voice was soft, her violet eyes steady on his, "now I can't imagine this land without you. Can't imagine facing another winter, another threat, another sunrise without you beside me." He took a breath, finding words that came harder than facing outlaws. "I love you, Catherine, not because you're beautiful, though you are, not because you're brave, though God knows you've proven that, but because you've made this empty land into a home. You've made me whole when I didn't even know I was broken." Catherine set aside the washing and stood, water dripping from her hands like diamonds in the sunlight. "Samuel Morrison," she said, her voice carrying a hint of the Boston accent she'd never quite lost. "Are you courting your own wife? Maybe I am. Maybe I'm saying what I should have said months ago." He stepped closer, close enough to see the tears gathering in her eyes. "Maybe I'm asking if you'd choose this again, knowing everything you know now." She reached up to touch his face, her hand work-roughened but gentle. Every hardship, every storm, every battle, I'd choose it all again, because it led me here. To you. To us. Even the beauty that transformed my world? He asked, echoing his own long-ago thought with a wry smile. Especially that. She laughed, since it seems to have transformed both our worlds in ways neither of us expected. He kissed her then, there by the creek with the mountains as witness, pouring into it all the love that had grown through trials unimaginable a year ago. When they broke apart, both were breathless. I love you too, Catherine whispered. My serious, steady rancher who turned out to be anything but ordinary. They walked back to the house hand in hand, past the garden blooming with vegetables and flowers, past the corral where healthy cattle grazed, past all the evidence of their joint labor. On the porch, Samuel paused, looking out over their domain. What are you thinking? Catherine asked. About the future. About maybe adding another room or two to the house. He glanced at her significantly. For when our family grows. Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. That sounds like excellent planning. Mr. Morrison. Very practical. I'm a practical man. He agreed solemnly, then ruined it with a grin. That evening, they sat on their porch as they often did, watching the sun paint the mountains in its farewell colors. The land that had tested them so harshly now seemed to embrace them, accepting them as its own. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Not threatening now, just part of the wild chorus they'd learned to appreciate. No regrets? Samuel asked one more time, his arm around her shoulders. Catherine leaned into his warmth, thinking of all the paths that had led to this moment. The merchant's daughter who'd lost everything in Boston had found more than she'd ever dreamed possible in these unforgiving mountains. She'd found strength she didn't know she possessed, courage born of necessity, and love forged in the crucible of survival. No regrets, she confirmed, only gratitude. As stars began to pierce the darkening sky, Catherine thought about the letter she'd write to her sisters tomorrow, telling them of this life she'd built with a man who'd expected ordinary and embraced extraordinary. She'd tell them about the mountains that challenged and sheltered in equal measure, about the community that had tested and finally accepted her, about the love that had grown from a practical arrangement into something deep and unshakable. But mostly, she'd tell them she was happy, truly, completely happy in a way she'd never imagined possible when she'd answered that advertisement a lifetime ago. Samuel pressed a kiss to her hair. What was it you said that first day about beauty being an accident of birth? I remember. You were wrong. His voice was certain. Your real beauty, the strength, the courage, the determination, that was no accident. That's who you are. That's who I fell in love with. In the growing darkness, Catherine smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new tests of their partnership. But tonight, in this moment, everything was perfect. The Eastern lady and the Western rancher, bound by choice and strengthened by trials, had found something neither had dared to hope for, a love as enduring as the mountains themselves. He thought his bride would be ordinary, but her beauty had indeed transformed his world, just not in any way either of them could have imagined on that dusty afternoon when she'd stepped off the stage and into a life worth every hardship it had demanded. Thank you all for listening to this tale of love and survival in the Old West. I'd love to hear where you're enjoying this story from, whether you're driving through the mountains, relaxing at home, or perhaps even somewhere out on the range. Please subscribe to Wild West Campfire and share your thoughts about Catherine and Samuel's journey. What part of their story touched you most? Let us know in the comments below.